A drunk driver's SUV slams into a service dog at a quiet intersection in Wilmington, North Carolina, the impact echoing through the humid September night like a gunshot. The animal, a 4-year-old German shepherd named Atlas, crumples onto the asphalt, his hind legs twisted at an unnatural angle. The driver doesn't brake, doesn't slow. The taillights disappear around the corner, engine roaring with acceleration, leaving behind only the scent of burned rubber and the high, agonizing whimpers of a dog who'd spent 3 years guiding a blind veteran through a world he could no longer see. But the driver didn't know someone was watching. Someone who'd tracked moving targets through the mountains of Afghanistan. Someone trained to remember faces, license plates, tactical details in the chaos of crisis. Someone whose moral code didn't recognize the difference between foreign enemies and domestic predators who fled the scene of their crimes. Before we begin, tell us where you are watching from, and if this story touches your heart, please subscribe for more stories of justice and courage. Marcus Thompson was 36 years old, though the lines around his eyes suggested a man who'd lived decades longer. Those eyes, a deep brown that had once scanned horizons and enemy positions with perfect clarity, now saw only shadows and light, vague shapes moving through a permanent fog that no surgery could lift. The IED that took his sight in Kandahar province 7 years ago had left his face unmarked, a cruel trick that meant strangers rarely understood his disability until he reached for Atlas's harness, until they noticed the way he moved through the world with one hand extended, trusting his partner to navigate the dangers he couldn't see. Tonight, Marcus wore a faded Marine Corps t-shirt beneath a light jacket, jeans worn soft from years of wear, and boots he could lace by feel alone. His hair, cropped military short despite his medical retirement, showed streaks of premature gray at the temples. His hands, scarred across the knuckles from physical therapy, from learning to function in darkness, gripped Atlas's handle with the unconscious confidence of thousands of hours of partnership. They stood at the corner of 3rd and Market Street, waiting for the pedestrian signal Marcus could hear but not see. September in Wilmington meant humidity that pressed against skin like a warm towel, the salt-tinged breeze from the Cape Fear River mixing with exhaust fumes, and the frying oil smell drifting from a nearby restaurant. The city hummed with Friday night energy, cars passing in waves, voices from bar patios, the distant thrum of music from the downtown district 3 blocks south. Marcus had spent the evening at a veteran support group meeting, one of the mandatory check-ins the VA required to maintain his disability benefits. 3 hours of sitting in a circle, sharing struggles with men and women who understood what civilians couldn't. The weight of coming home broken, the grinding bureaucracy of medical claims, the isolation of being surrounded by people who looked through you rather than at you. The meeting had run late. Marcus was exhausted, a bone-deep weariness that came from forcing cheerfulness he didn't feel, from pretending the system was working when they'd cut his mental health sessions from twice weekly to once monthly due to funding reallocation. Atlas sensed his handler's fatigue. The German shepherd, 85 pounds of muscle, intelligence, and unwavering devotion, pressed closer against Marcus's left leg, his trained position. Atlas's coat was the rich black and tan of his breed, his ears alert, his dark eyes constantly scanning for obstacles, for threats, for the 100 small dangers a blind man couldn't avoid alone. At 4 years old, Atlas was in his prime, a graduate of Freedom Service dogs who'd been matched with Marcus 2 years ago after 18 months of specialized training. But Atlas was more than a tool, more than highly trained assistance equipment. He was the reason Marcus had stopped planning his suicide, the reason Marcus got out of bed when depression made the darkness inside match the darkness outside, the reason Marcus still believed some things in this world were worth protecting. The dog had a medical condition, a heart murmur discovered during his 6-month checkup, a defect that required monthly monitoring and medication that cost $273 per bottle. The vet said Atlas had years of good service ahead if the condition stayed stable, but the warning was clear. Stress, overexertion, or trauma could trigger cardiac complications. Marcus had added the expense to the growing pile of bills on his kitchen counter. The apartment rent increasing 15% this year. The medical debt from surgeries insurance only partially covered. The cost of existing in a country that thanked him for his service, but didn't want to pay for his survival. He'd walk to the meeting tonight because his truck needed a transmission repair he couldn't afford. The walk was 2 miles each way, manageable in daylight, but challenging after dark when his remaining light perception faded to nothing. Atlas knew the route, but intersections still required caution, still demanded Marcus trust the traffic signals and the drivers around him to follow the rules, to see him, to care enough to stop. The crosswalk signal began its rhythmic beeping, the tone Marcus had learned to trust absolutely. "Forward," Marcus commanded softly, his hand relaxed on the harness handle. Atlas stepped into the street, his gait steady and confident, guiding Marcus into the crosswalk at the measured pace they'd practiced 10,000 times. They were 3 steps from the opposite curb when the SUV came around the corner. Marcus heard the engine first, the too loud roar of acceleration, the squeal of tires taking the turn too fast. He heard Atlas's sudden intake of breath, felt the dog's body tense beneath the harness, sensed the animal's split-second decision to push forward, to get his handler out of danger. Then came the impact. The sound was meaty and terrible, a thud that Marcus felt through the harness before it ripped from his hand. He heard Atlas cry out, a sound no dog should make, raw and agonized, and then the scrape of the animal's body tumbling across asphalt. The SUV's engine roared louder, accelerating instead of stopping, and Marcus stood frozen in the middle of the intersection, his hand still extended where Atlas had been, his world reduced to sound and the nauseating certainty that everything had just shattered. "Atlas!" Marcus dropped to his knees, hands outstretched, searching the pavement desperately. "Atlas here, boy. Atlas." His fingers found warm fur, a body that trembled and whimpered. Marcus's hands moved across Atlas's frame with practiced efficiency, assessing damage the way he'd been trained to check wounded Marines for injuries. The dog's front half seemed intact, but his hindquarters were wrong. The angle of the legs, the way Atlas flinched and yelped when Marcus's fingers found the hip joint, the rapid panting that spoke of shock and pain. Car horns began blaring. Someone shouted. Marcus heard footsteps approaching, but no one touched him. No one spoke directly to him, and he realized with sick clarity that he was the spectacle now. The blind man kneeling in the street with his broken dog, halting traffic, creating a scene. "Someone call 911. Marcus shouted toward the shapes moving in his peripheral darkness. "My dog was hit. The car drove off. Did anyone see the license plate?" His voice cracked on the last word. Atlas whimpered again, trying to lick Marcus's hand, still trying to comfort his handler even as his own body betrayed him. Marcus felt moisture on his face and realized he was crying, hot tears cutting tracks through the dust on his cheeks. 30 feet away, standing in the recessed doorway of a closed antique shop, a man watched the scene unfold with the cold assessment of someone trained to evaluate tactical situations in seconds. The man was 32 years old, 6 feet tall, with the lean, coiled build of someone who viewed his body as a weapon requiring constant maintenance. His hair was dark blonde and cut high and tight, his face angular and weather-worn, his eyes a pale gray that seemed to catalog everything in his field of vision simultaneously. He wore civilian clothes, dark jeans, a navy blue Henley, weathered boots, but his posture betrayed his background. The way he stood with his back to the wall, the way his eyes tracked movement patterns, the way his hands stayed relaxed, but ready near his sides. His name was Sergeant First Class Daniel Reese, United States Navy, Naval Special Warfare Development Group. On paper, he was a communications specialist. In reality, he was a member of SEAL Team 6, though he'd never confirmed that to a civilian. He'd spent the last 14 months deployed to undisclosed locations doing work he'd never discuss, and he was exactly 18 hours into a 30-day leave he'd been required to take after a mission that had gone sideways in ways that would haunt him for years. Daniel had come to Wilmington because he had nowhere else to go. His apartment in Virginia Beach felt like a storage unit rather than a home. His parents were dead, his brother was deployed, and the woman he thought he might marry had left him 2 years ago after deciding she couldn't spend her life waiting for a knock on the door from men in dress uniforms. He'd chosen Wilmington randomly, pointing at a map, wanting to be near water that wasn't an ocean he'd operated in, wanting to be somewhere no one knew his name. He'd been walking back to his hotel when he'd noticed the veteran with the service dog, had noticed the way the man moved with careful confidence, the way the dog worked with focused intensity, the way the pair functioned as a single unit. Daniel recognized it immediately. The trust, the bond, the kind of partnership you could only build through shared adversity. He'd seen it in his own teams, had felt it with brothers who'd covered his six in situations where a heartbeat's hesitation meant death. He'd also noticed the black Audi Q7 weaving through traffic 2 blocks back, the driver visible through the windshield, young male, his head bobbing to music, a bottle visible in his hand between sips. Daniel had tracked the vehicle with professional paranoia, had calculated its speed and trajectory, had felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came when his training screamed warnings his conscious mind hadn't yet processed. He'd been 20 yards away when the SUV hit the dog. Daniel had seen the whole thing. Had seen the driver, early 20s, white, wearing what looked like a polo shirt, glanced down at his phone for 3 seconds before the turn. Had seen the moment of impact, the way the driver's head snapped up, the flash of panic across his face. Had seen the driver make the decision to accelerate, to flee, to pretend it hadn't happened. And Daniel had done what his training demanded. He'd memorized every detail. The license plate, North Carolina tags, number NCL 4782. The vehicle, black Audi Q7, late model, aftermarket chrome wheels, a sticker in the rear window that looked like a university parking permit. The driver, clean cut, wearing a light blue polo, no visible passengers, a Greek letters tattoo on his left forearm visible when he'd reached for the gear shift. Daniel had also noticed the way the driver had looked back in his rearview mirror, not with horror or regret, but with calculation, the look of someone assessing whether he'd be caught, whether there were witnesses, whether he could get away with it. Now Daniel watched Marcus cradle his injured dog in the middle of the intersection, watched the gathering crowd of spectators who filmed on their phones, but didn't approach, watched the cars beginning to route around the scene with irritated honks. He watched a Wilmington Police Department cruiser pull up, lights flashing, and a young officer step out with the weary expression of someone dealing with the 10th inconvenient situation of his shift. Daniel made his decision in the space between heartbeats. He crossed the street with the fluid, purposeful stride of someone accustomed to entering hostile situations, his boots making no sound despite their weight. He reached Marcus's side and dropped to one knee, his voice low and calm and carrying the unconscious authority of someone who gave orders in crisis situations. "Sir, my name is Daniel. I'm a corpsman." The lie came easily. It was technically true, though Daniel's medical training was focused on combat trauma, not veterinary care. "I saw what happened. Let me help you with your dog." Marcus's head turned toward the voice, relief and desperation warring across his face. "He's hurt bad. His back legs. I think his hip is broken. The car just drove off. Did you see it? Did you see the driver?" "I saw everything," Daniel said quietly. "And I have the license plate. But first, let's get your partner out of the street and assess his injuries. Can he be moved?" "I don't know. I don't know if moving him will make it worse." Daniel's hands were already moving across Atlas's body with professional efficiency, gentler than Marcus's panicked assessment, but more thorough. He felt along the spine, checked the ribs, palpated the abdomen for internal bleeding. The hip was definitely fractured. He could feel the displacement, but the dog's breathing was steady, his gums pink when Daniel checked capillary refill. The heart murmur was audible now, a slight arrhythmia that worried him, but not immediately life-threatening. "His spine is intact, no obvious internal bleeding," Daniel reported. "The hip is fractured, probably a posterior dislocation. It's serious, but if we can get him to an emergency vet in the next 30 minutes, he has a good chance. I'm going to stabilize the leg, and we're going to move him together. On my count." The police officer had finally made his way over, his flashlight beam cutting across the scene. "Sir, you need to clear the intersection. You're blocking traffic." Daniel looked up at the officer, and something in his expression, the absolute calm, the unwavering focus, made the young cop take a half step back. "In approximately 90 seconds, we'll have this veteran and his service dog out of the intersection," Daniel said, his voice level, but carrying an edge that suggested contradiction wasn't advisable. "While we do that, you're going to call Animal Emergency Services and get an ETA for transport." Then you're going to take a statement about the hit and run I witnessed, including the license plate number of the vehicle that struck this animal and fled the scene." The officer opened his mouth, closed it, and reached for his radio. The emergency veterinary clinic was a low, modern building on the outskirts of Wilmington's commercial district, all glass and steel, and the kind of sterile brightness that hurt Marcus's light-sensitive eyes. Daniel had ridden in the ambulance with Marcus and Atlas, had insisted on it over the paramedics' protests, had produced military ID, and used a tone that ended arguments, and now sat in the waiting room while surgeons worked on the injured dog behind closed doors. Marcus sat beside him, his hands clasped between his knees, his body hunched with the weight of helplessness. They'd been here for 2 hours. The receptionist had asked for a credit card before they'd even examined Atlas, had informed Marcus that emergency orthopedic surgery would cost between $4,000 and $7,000, depending on complications, had presented him with treatment authorization forms that his trembling hands couldn't read, and Daniel had quietly summarized for him. Marcus had handed over his visa, knowing it would be declined. The card had a $3,000 limit and was already within $200 of maximum. He'd said nothing, had simply signed the forms and prayed the surgery would be finished before the payment processing triggered the inevitable rejection. Daniel had watched this exchange and said nothing, but he'd noted the way Marcus's jaw tightened, the way his shoulders hunched, the visible shame of a man forced to choose between his dog's life and financial ruin. Daniel had seen that look before, on the faces of Afghan interpreters trying to buy their families way out of Taliban territory, on the faces of junior enlisted guys whose cars broke down and who didn't have enough saved to cover the repair. Around them, the waiting room held the standard population of veterinary emergencies: a couple with a cat in a carrier, the animal yowling with distress, a family with a Labrador who'd apparently eaten a bottle of ibuprofen, a young woman crying quietly while she filled out forms for a dog who'd been attacked at a dog park. The room smelled of disinfectant and fear, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, a television mounted in the corner, playing the local news on mute. Daniel was halfway through his third cup of bad coffee when he noticed a man enter through the front doors. The newcomer was in his early 50s, tall and thick through the middle in the way of men who'd been athletic in youth and had let comfort replace discipline. He wore khakis and a golf shirt, expensive leather loafers, and a watch that Daniel recognized as a Rolex Submariner, a $12,000 timepiece that marked him as either wealthy or deeply in debt. His hair was silver gray and professionally styled, his face carrying the ruddy complexion of someone who spent time on boats and golf courses, his expression radiating the casual entitlement of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. He was accompanied by a younger man, late 20s, athletic build, wearing a light blue polo shirt that made Daniel's attention sharpen. The younger man's left forearm bore visible Greek letters, Sigma Alpha Epsilon. Sigma Alpha Epsilon, the same fraternity letters Daniel had glimpsed on the hit-and-run driver's arm. The older man approached the reception desk with the confidence of someone who knew his presence mattered. "Excuse me," he said to the receptionist, his voice carrying the practiced boom of a man used to being heard. "I'm looking for information about a dog that was brought in earlier tonight. German Shepherd, hit by a car. I'm here on behalf of the family involved in the incident." Daniel's hand tightened on his coffee cup. Marcus, blind to the visual cues, continued staring at the floor, lost in his own anxiety. The receptionist, a young woman with purple-streaked hair and exhausted eyes, looked up from her computer with the automatic smile of someone trained in customer service. "I'm sorry, sir, but I can't release patient information unless you're the owner or authorized representative." Of course. The man's smile widened, showing too many teeth. "I understand completely. Let me clarify. My name is Richard Harding. My son was the driver involved in tonight's unfortunate accident. We're here to take responsibility, to make sure the animal receives the best possible care, and to work with the owner to resolve this matter quickly and fairly." The words were perfect. The tone was reasonable. But Daniel heard what civilians wouldn't: the careful phrasing of accident rather than hit and run, the emphasis on resolve quickly, the underlying message that money could make problems disappear. Marcus's head came up slowly, his blind eyes turning toward the voice. "Your son," Your son hit my dog and drove away. He left Atlas in the street. He didn't stop, didn't call for help, didn't. Mr. Thompson, is it? Richard Harding's voice shifted, becoming softer, more sympathetic. He crossed the waiting room and extended his hand before apparently realizing Marcus couldn't see it. My son Brandon is devastated about what happened. He's a good kid, a college senior, headed to law school next year. He'd had a few drinks at a fraternity event. Not enough to impair him, you understand, but enough that he panicked when the accident happened. He made a terrible decision in a moment of fear. But he came straight home, told me everything, and we're here now to make this right. Brandon Harding stood behind his father, his hands shoved in his pockets, his face carrying an expression of practiced contrition that didn't reach his eyes. Daniel studied him with the cold assessment of someone trained in hostile pattern recognition. The young man's pupils were still dilated despite the bright lights. His shirt was rumpled, his hair mussed in a way that suggested hasty dressing. He wore boat shoes without socks, and when he shifted his weight, Daniel saw the slight unsteadiness of someone who was still intoxicated, who'd been dragged here by his father before he'd had time to sober up completely. This wasn't contrition. This was damage control. Make it right. Marcus's voice rose, anger finally breaking through shock. Your son shattered my dog's hip and drove away. Atlas is a trained service dog. He's not a pet. He's medical equipment I need to function. His voice cracked. He's my partner, and your son left him dying in the street. I understand you're upset, Mr. Thompson. Anyone would be. Richard Harding's voice remained calm, reasonable, the tone of a man accustomed to negotiating settlements. That's why I've already called our attorney and our insurance company. We're going to cover all of Atlas's medical expenses. Every penny. And we'd like to offer you compensation for your distress and inconvenience. Say $10,000. The offer hung in the air like smoke. Daniel watched Marcus's face, saw the moment hope and suspicion collided. $10,000 would cover the surgery and months of expenses beyond. $10,000 was more money than Marcus probably had in savings. $10,000 was enough to be tempting, to make a traumatized man consider taking the path of least resistance. But Daniel also saw the calculation in Richard Harding's eyes, the way Brandon smirked slightly behind his father's back, the way both men stood as if they'd already won. There's one small condition, Richard continued smoothly. We need you to sign a release form, something simple that just confirms the matter is settled, that you accept the compensation as full and final resolution. It protects both of us, you understand, prevents any future misunderstandings. A release form, Marcus repeated slowly. Just standard legal language. I have it right here. Richard pulled a folded document from his pocket, the paper already prepared, already waiting. My attorney drafted it this evening. 3 pages, very straightforward. It essentially says you agree the incident was an unfortunate accident, that all expenses have been covered, and that you won't pursue any further claims, civil or criminal, against Brandon or our family. In exchange, you receive the $10,000, plus all medical bills paid. Daniel set his coffee cup down very carefully on the side table, the ceramic making a soft click against the wood. The sound drew Richard Harding's attention for the first time, and their eyes met. Something passed between them in that moment. Daniel's expression was neutral, but his eyes carried the flat, cold assessment of a predator recognizing another predator's territorial display. Richard's smile faltered slightly, his salesman's instinct recognizing a different kind of negotiation entirely. $10,000 to sign away my right to report that your son committed a felony hit-and-run, Marcus said quietly. To agree it was an accident when he was driving drunk and fled the scene. To let him walk away without consequences. Now, Mr. Thompson, let's not use inflammatory language like felony. Leave, Marcus said. I'm sorry. Get out. Marcus stood, his body trembling with anger that had finally found its outlet. You're not here because your son feels guilty. You're here because someone probably got your license plate number, and you're trying to keep him out of jail. You want to throw money at me, so I'll go away quietly. So I'll be a good little disabled veteran and not make trouble for the rich family with connections. Mr. Thompson, I think you're overreacting. I said get out. Marcus's voice cracked like a whip, loud enough that everyone in the waiting room turned to stare. Get out before I have you removed. Brandon Harding finally spoke, his voice carrying the sneering edge of entitled youth confronted with resistance. Jesus Christ, Dad, I told you this guy would be difficult. Probably just looking for a payday, trying to scam us for more. Daniel stood in a single fluid motion, his body language shifting from relaxed observer to immediate threat with the kind of transformation that made civilians' hindbrain survival instincts scream warnings. He didn't raise his voice, didn't move closer, simply stood, and the room's entire dynamic changed. You're going to want to stop talking now, Daniel said quietly. You're going to want to take your father's advice and leave. And you're going to want to do it before I walk over to that police officer in the corner and give him my formal statement as a witness to tonight's hit and run, including my detailed description of you driving away from the scene while visibly intoxicated. Richard Harding's face flushed red. And who the hell are you? Daniel pulled his wallet from his pocket and flipped it open, holding it at eye level so both Hardings could see the military identification card inside. Sergeant First Class Daniel Reese, United States Navy, Naval Special Warfare Group 2. I was approximately 20 yards from the intersection when your son's vehicle struck Mr. Thompson's service dog. I observed the entire incident. I have a photographic record of your son's license plate, a detailed timeline of events, and 17 years of experience testifying in military and civilian courts about operational observations. Would you like me to continue? The silence that followed was absolute. Even the yowling cat in the carrier seemed to sense the tension and fell quiet. Brandon Harding had gone pale, the bravado draining from his face as he recognized that the situation had escalated beyond his father's ability to buy their way out. Richard Harding's expression cycled through calculation, anger, and finally a forced neutrality that came from recognizing he'd lost the opening gambit. I see, Richard said slowly. Well, I can see emotions are running high tonight. Perhaps we should all take some time to cool down, speak with our respective attorneys, and approach the situation more rationally in the morning. Perhaps you should take your son home and hire him a good criminal defense attorney, Daniel said flatly, because in approximately 90 seconds, I'm going to walk over to Officer Campbell, whose name tag I memorized when he responded to the scene, and provide my formal witness statement. That statement will include my observation that your son appeared visibly intoxicated at the time of the incident, that he failed to stop and render aid, and that he fled the scene of an accident involving injury. In North Carolina, that's a Class H felony. Add the DWI component, and your son is looking at potential jail time even with a plea deal. You're making a mistake, Richard said, his voice hardening. My family has deep roots in this community. We have connections. We support the Police Foundation, the District Attorney's re-election campaign, the Mayor's charitable initiatives. You're a stranger here, and Mr. Thompson is. He caught himself, but the damage was done. Go ahead, Marcus said, his voice shaking but determined. Finish that sentence. I'm what? Disabled? Not important. Not worth protecting. Richard Harding's jaw tightened. I was going to say you're in a vulnerable position, Mr. Thompson. Medical debt, no job. No way to care for an injured service dog for months while he recovers. That's not a threat, that's reality. We're offering you a way out of a terrible situation. Pride is expensive. Justice is expensive. Sometimes practicality is the better choice. Officer Campbell, Daniel called across the waiting room, his voice carrying command authority that made the young cop's head snap up instinctively. I'm ready to provide my witness statement now. The Hardings left 3 minutes later, Richard's face set in stone, Brandon shooting venomous looks over his shoulder as his father steered him toward the exit. Daniel watched them go with the patient focus of someone who knew this was the opening exchange in a longer campaign. Marcus sank back into his chair, the adrenaline leaving him trembling. Thank you, he said quietly. But you should know he was right. About my situation. I can't afford a legal battle. I can't even afford Atlas's surgery if my credit card gets declined. And people like the Hardings? They do have connections. They do have power. I've been through this before with the VA. with landlords, with employers. The system protects people like them. Daniel sat down beside him, his voice calm and absolutely certain. Mr. Thompson, the system protects them until someone forces accountability, until someone who knows how to navigate that system stands in their way and refuses to move. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I have 30 days of leave. I have no family, no commitments, and no patience for people who think wealth makes them untouchable. If you'll let me, I'm going to help you fight this. Not because I'm a hero, not because I'm looking for glory, but because I watched your dog guide you across that street with the kind of devotion I've only seen in combat, and I watched that kid destroy that partnership without remorse. Someone needs to stand in the gap. Tonight, that's me. Marcus turned his blind eyes toward Daniel's voice, tears cutting tracks down his face. Why? You don't even know me. I don't have to know you. I know what you've given in service to this country, and I know what you're still giving every day just to survive in it. That's enough. Before Marcus could respond, the surgical suite doors opened and a veterinarian in scrubs approached, her face tired, but carrying the expression of someone with good news. Mr. Thompson? Atlas came through surgery beautifully. The hip has been repaired with plates and screws, and his vital signs are stable. The heart murmur did cause some complications. We had to be very careful with anesthesia, but he's resting comfortably now. He'll need 12 weeks of strict rest and physical therapy, but with proper care, he should make a full recovery. Marcus's shoulders shook with relief. Can I see him? In about an hour, once he's more alert. But Mr. Thompson, I need to discuss post-operative care and costs. The surgery was $7,200. Post-operative medications, follow-up appointments, and physical therapy will run approximately $3,000 more over the next 3 months. And he'll need round-the-clock monitoring for the first week. Do you have someone who can help with his care? Marcus's relief shattered into despair. He shook his head mutely. Daniel stood, pulled out his wallet, and handed the vet a black credit card. Bill everything to this card, he said simply. All current and future expenses related to Atlas's care until he's fully recovered. And yes, Mr. Thompson has someone who can help with monitoring. I'm on medical leave for the next 30 days. I'll be staying with him. Daniel, I can't let you. It's already done, Daniel said quietly. Fight with me later if you want. But for right now, your dog is safe. His treatment is covered, and you have backup. Let that be enough for tonight. The receptionist approached Marcus with apologetic timing that suggested she'd been waiting for a break in the conversation. Mr. Thompson? I'm sorry, but your credit card was declined. Do you have another form of payment? Marcus closed his eyes, the final indignity washing over him. Daniel handed her his card without comment. The Wilmington Police Department's night shift changed at midnight, and Officer Campbell filed Daniel's witness statement at 11:47 p.m., 13 minutes before Sergeant Kyle Morrison came on duty. Morrison was a 22-year veteran of the force, a broad-shouldered man in his late 40s, with close-cropped gray hair and the confident bearing of someone who knew where all the bodies were buried, sometimes literally. He'd grown up in Wilmington, had played football with half the city council, and had learned early that power in a small city wasn't about laws, but about relationships. Morrison saw the hit-and-run report flagged on his desk computer and felt his stomach drop when he read the license plate number. NCL 4782. Brandon Harding's Audi. Richard Harding's kid. He picked up his phone and dialed a number from memory. Richard, it's Kyle. We have a problem. Richard Harding's voice on the other end was tight with controlled anger. I'm aware. I just spent 2 hours at an emergency vet clinic trying to settle this quietly, and some Navy SEAL decided to play hero. Campbell took his statement before I could shut this down. A SEAL. Morrison's tone shifted, becoming more cautious. Military complicated things. The DA hated cases involving service members because they tended to attract media attention, and veterans advocacy groups had political connections that crossed party lines. Sergeant something. Daniel Reese. He saw everything, has the plate number, and apparently decided this blind guy is his new charity case. Richard's voice dripped with contempt. I offered Thompson $10,000 to sign a release. The SEAL convinced him to refuse. Morrison pulled up the incident report, read Daniel's statement with growing concern. It was detailed, precise, written in the formal language of someone who'd testified before. License plate, time stamps, description of the driver's appearance, observation of visible intoxication, documentation of the victim's injuries. It was the kind of statement that prosecutors loved because it left no room for defense attorneys to create reasonable doubt. This is bad, Richard. This statement is airtight. If this goes to the DA, Brandon's looking at DWI with property damage, felony hit and run, potentially reckless endangerment if they argue the service dog angle. That's jail time even with a plea. Which is why it can't go to the DA. Richard's voice hardened. Brandon is 3 months from graduating summa cum laude. He has a full ride to Duke Law School starting next fall. One felony conviction destroys everything he's worked for, everything we've invested in his future. This needs to disappear, Kyle. That's why I'm calling you at midnight instead of waiting for office hours. Morrison was quiet for a moment, the silence heavy with calculation. The blind guy. Thompson. What do we know about him? Marine Corps veteran, medically retired, lives alone in a shit apartment off 17th Street. No family, no job for what I could tell. The kind of guy who's one bad month away from being homeless. The SEAL. In town on leave, staying at the Hampton in downtown. No local connections, no reason to stay longer than his vacation. He'll deploy eventually, disappear back to Virginia Beach or wherever these guys operate out of. Morrison made a decision, the kind of decision he'd made a dozen times over 2 decades of protecting the interests that mattered. Okay, here's what we do. The report stays filed. We can't make it disappear completely because Campbell already logged it into the system. But it doesn't go to the DA until we've investigated thoroughly. That buys us time. I'll go talk to Thompson tomorrow. See if we can convince him that pursuing this is more trouble than it's worth. Meanwhile, you keep Brandon out of sight. Make sure he doesn't do anything stupid like post on social media or talk to his friends. What about the SEAL? Leave him to me. Military guys are trained to trust the chain of command, to believe the system works. I'll explain that we take these reports seriously, that we're building a case, that everything's being handled by the book. By the time he realizes we're slow-walking this, his leave will be over and he'll be gone. And if he doesn't leave it alone... Morrison's voice went cold. Then we make his life complicated. Run his background, see if there's anything we can use. Talk to his command. Let them know one of their guys is causing problems on leave, making accusations about local families. The Navy doesn't like SEALs drawing attention. They'll rein him in. They spoke for another 10 minutes, coordinating strategy with the practiced ease of men who'd protected each other's interests for years. When Morrison hung up, he felt confident they could contain this. Thompson was vulnerable, isolated, and desperate. The SEAL was temporary. Brandon Harding would weather the storm like he'd weathered every other consequence his privilege had shielded him from. What Morrison didn't know was that Daniel Reese had spent his entire adult life operating in environments where trusting official channels meant death, where assuming the system would function meant mission failure, and where documentation was the difference between accountability and deniability. Daniel had filmed his verbal witness statement on his phone before giving it to Officer Campbell, had recorded his conversation with Richard Harding in the veterinary clinic waiting room, had photographed Brandon Harding's face, the Greek letters on his arm, the Rolex on Richard's wrist, and the business card Richard had left on the reception counter. Harding Maritime Holdings, specializing in waterfront property development and marina management. He'd also made 3 phone calls, while Marcus sat with Atlas in the recovery room. The first was to his team leader, Lieutenant Commander James Walsh, informing him that Daniel would be unavailable for recall during his leave due to a civilian legal matter requiring his testimony as a witness. The call lasted 4 minutes and ended with Walsh's dry comment, "Stay out of trouble, Reese. Or at least win if you're going to start it." The second was to a JAG officer at Naval Station Norfolk, whom Daniel had worked with on 2 cases involving military contractors. Captain Sarachan listened to Daniel's summary, asked pointed questions about jurisdiction and evidence, and promised to send him contact information for a civilian attorney in Wilmington who specialized in police misconduct and had a reputation for not being intimidated by local power structures. The third call was to a Master Chief at his command who owed Daniel his life after a helicopter extraction gone wrong in Yemen. Daniel explained the situation in 3 sentences and made a simple request. I need someone watching my 6 for the next 30 days. If anyone from Wilmington PD contacts our command with questions or complaints about me, I want to know immediately. The Master Chief's response was immediate and unequivocal. You've got eyes on Overwatch, brother. Anyone comes sniffing around, they'll have to go through me first. And Reese, don't do anything I wouldn't do. That leaves a lot of room for interpretation, Master Chief. Exactly. By the time Daniel returned to the recovery room, Marcus was sitting on the floor beside Atlas's cage, his hand resting against the mesh where the sedated dog could sense his presence. The German shepherd's breathing was steady, his injured leg immobilized in a complex brace, and 4 line trailing from his foreleg to a pump that dispensed pain medication in measured doses. He's dreaming, Marcus said quietly when he heard Daniel approach. His paws are twitching. I hope he's dreaming about running, about being whole again. Daniel knelt beside him, studying the dog's face. Atlas was indeed dreaming, his eyes moving beneath closed lids, his ears flicking at imagined sounds. He will run again. The vet said full recovery with proper care. Proper care I can't provide. Daniel, I've been sitting here thinking about everything that's happened tonight, and I need you to understand my situation before you get in any deeper. Marcus's voice was steady but resigned. I can't pay you back for the surgery. I can't afford to miss work to take care of Atlas. Except I don't have work to miss, because I was fired 3 weeks ago when my employer decided my disability accommodations were too expensive. I can't hire an attorney to fight the Hardings. I can't even afford my rent next month. You're a good man for wanting to help, but this is my reality. Eventually, you're going to realize I'm a lost cause, and you'll move on. Everyone does. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, watching the dog dream. When I was 24, he finally said, I froze during my first real combat engagement. We were clearing a compound in Ramadi, and I came around a corner, and there was an insurgent with an AK pointing straight at my chest. I froze, completely locked up. My team leader, a chief named Rodriguez, put 2 rounds in the guy before he could pull the trigger. Saved my life. Then Rodriguez grabbed me by my plate carrier, dragged me behind cover, and said something I've never forgotten. Marcus tilted his head, listening. He said, Reese, you've got 3 choices right now. You can quit and go home knowing you'll live with that hesitation for the rest of your life. You can pretend it didn't happen and probably get yourself or someone else killed next time. Or you can accept that you're human, that fear is real, and that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing the job anyway. Then he asked me which man I wanted to be. What did you choose? I chose to stay. Finished the deployment, went through 2 more after that, eventually made it through selection for advanced units. But the lesson wasn't about combat. It was about the moment when you decide whether you're the kind of person who walks away when things get hard, or whether you're the kind who stands the line even when it's costly. Daniel stood, offering Marcus his hand and pulling him to his feet. You're not a lost cause, Marcus. You're a Marine who got dealt a shit hand and is still standing. And I'm not helping you because I expect repayment. I'm helping you because the alternative is walking away and becoming someone I don't want to be. So here's what we're going to do. You're going to accept my help without guilt. I'm going to make some calls and solve some problems. And together, we're going to make sure the Hardings learn that actions have consequences. The system protects them. Only until someone forces the system to work properly. And Marcus, forcing things to work properly is literally what I do for a living. By Sunday afternoon, Marcus understood what Richard Harding had meant about connections. It started with an email from his landlord's property management company, sent at 8:47 a.m. with the subject line, Notice of Lease Violation and Mandatory Evacuation. The email cited an obscure clause in his lease agreement prohibiting pets that required extensive medical care or created sanitation hazards. It demanded he vacate the apartment within 72 hours or face immediate eviction proceedings. The email was CC'd to an attorney's office Marcus had never heard of. At 10:15 a.m., a Wilmington animal control officer knocked on Marcus's door with a complaint that had been filed anonymously claiming his service dog was a public health risk due to inadequate care and unsanitary conditions. The officer, a middle-aged woman who clearly found the complaint dubious, explained she was required to inspect the premises and document Atlas's living conditions. She spent 20 minutes looking around Marcus's small, scrupulously clean apartment, took photographs of Atlas's water bowl and bed, and left with a verbal reassurance that the complaint was obviously frivolous, but warned that a formal investigation file had been opened. At 1:33 p.m., Marcus received a certified letter from a law firm he'd never dealt with, Castellan, Whitmore and Associates, representing Coastal Carolina Marina Group. The letter informed him that he was being sued for defamation and tortious interference with business relationships related to false and malicious statements made about Richard Harding and his family. The lawsuit demanded $15,000 in damages and included a motion for a restraining order preventing Marcus from contacting the Harding family or discussing the incident publicly pending resolution of the civil case. And at 3 p.m., Sergeant Kyle Morrison appeared at Marcus's door with a friendly smile and a sympathetic tone that made Daniel's instincts scream warnings. "Mr. Thompson, I'm Sergeant Morrison, WPD. I wanted to personally follow up on the incident from Friday night and make sure you understand what's happening with the investigation." Daniel had been in Marcus's apartment when Morrison knocked, had, in fact, been expecting some form of official visit after spending the morning researching Richard Harding's business connections and discovering his donations to the Police Athletic League, his sponsorship of the annual police charity golf tournament, and his wife's position on the city's Chamber of Commerce board. "Sergeant Morrison," Daniel said, opening the door fully and extending his hand with professional courtesy. "Daniel Reese. I provided the witness statement Friday night." Morrison smiled and faltered, but something shifted in his eyes. A calculation, a reassessment. "Ah, yes. The Navy serviceman. Thank you for your statement, Mr. Reese. Very thorough. Professional. Sergeant First Class," Daniel corrected mildly. "And documentation is part of my training. Would you like to come in?" They sat in Marcus's small living room, Morrison taking the armchair, while Daniel positioned himself on the couch beside Marcus, a subtle territorial statement that didn't escape the cop's notice. Morrison pulled out a small notebook, the gesture designed to appear official and reassuring. "Mr. Thompson, I want you to know we're taking this incident very seriously. Hit-and-run cases, especially those involving service animals, are a priority for our department. However, I also want to be transparent about the challenges we're facing with this particular case." "Challenges?" Marcus repeated, his tone flat. "Yes, sir. You see, while Sergeant Reese's statement is helpful, we're dealing with some evidentiary issues. The license plate he documented does belong to a vehicle registered to the Harding family. However, Brandon Harding claims the vehicle was taken without his permission that evening, that he'd left his keys at the fraternity house, and someone must have used his car without authorization." "That's bullshit," Daniel said calmly. "I observed Brandon Harding driving the vehicle. I can identify him by his physical appearance, his clothing, and the distinctive tattoo on his left forearm. I was approximately 20 yards away under good lighting conditions. My identification is positive and certain." Morrison's expression remained sympathetic, but his voice took on a slightly condescending edge, the tone of someone explaining hard truths to naive civilians. "I understand that, Sergeant, and your confidence in your observation is noted. However, defense attorneys will argue about visibility, about stress affecting perception, about the possibility of mistaken identity. These cases are difficult to prosecute even with the best evidence." "So you're not going to arrest him?" Marcus said quietly. "I'm saying that we need to build an airtight case before we make any moves. The district attorney's office has very high standards for prosecution, especially in cases involving prominent local families. If we move too quickly and the case falls apart in court, Brandon Harding walks away completely. But if we're patient, if we gather more evidence, if we can find additional witnesses or surveillance footage from businesses in the area, then we build something that can't be dismissed." "How long will that take?" Daniel asked, already knowing the answer. These investigations typically take 30 to 90 days, sometimes longer. It's not ideal, I understand your frustration, but it's the reality of due process. Due process, Marcus echoed bitterly. Meanwhile, I'm being evicted, sued for defamation, and investigated by animal control. All within 48 hours of refusing Richard Harding's hush money. And you're telling me that's just coincidence? Morrison's face hardened slightly, the sympathetic mask slipping. Mr. Thompson, I don't know anything about your personal legal issues. Those are civil matters, outside police jurisdiction. What I do know is that making accusations about wealthy families using their influence, without evidence, can be considered defamatory. I'd be very careful about what you say publicly. Is that a threat, Sergeant? Daniel's voice remained level, but the temperature in the room dropped several degrees. It's advice. Friendly advice from someone who's seen how these situations play out. Mr. Thompson, you've been through a traumatic experience. Your service dog was injured. You're facing financial pressure, and I'm sure emotions are running high. Sometimes, in situations like these, accepting a reasonable settlement is the wisest path forward. Pride doesn't pay medical bills or legal fees. He's here to deliver the same offer, Daniel said quietly to Marcus. Different packaging, same deal. They want you to sign the release and go away quietly. Morrison's jaw tightened. Sergeant Reese, I'm going to give you some advice too. You're on leave. You're in a city where you have no roots, and you're involving yourself in a civilian legal matter that doesn't concern you. I've made some inquiries, standard procedure for witness verification, and I understand you're with a specialized unit. The kind of unit that values discretion. The kind that probably doesn't appreciate their personnel attracting attention or involving themselves in local controversies. The threat was subtle but clear. Cause problems, and Morrison would contact Daniel's command. Daniel smiled, and it was the cold, predatory expression of someone who'd played this game at much higher stakes. Sergeant Morrison, I appreciate your concern for my career. However, I should clarify a few things. First, I've already informed my command about my involvement in this matter. Second, my statement is a matter of official record, and I'm prepared to testify under oath in any criminal or civil proceeding. Third, I'm very familiar with how evidence is documented, preserved, and protected from tampering or suppression. And fourth, he pulled his phone from his pocket and set it on the coffee table between them. This conversation is being recorded, as was my statement to Officer Campbell, as was my encounter with Richard Harding at the veterinary clinic. I believe in thorough documentation. Morrison stared at the phone, then at Daniel, his expression cycling through anger, calculation, and finally wary respect. You're making a mistake, he said quietly, standing. Both of you. The Hardings aren't people you want as enemies. Neither am I, Daniel said simply. After Morrison left, Marcus sat in silence for a long moment, his hands clasped between his knees. I can't win this, he finally said. You understand that, right? They're going to evict me. They're going to take Atlas. And even if by some miracle we get Brandon Harding charged, they'll bury me in legal fees until I give up. This is what they do. This is how power works. It's how power works when no one fights back, Daniel corrected. But you're not alone in this fight. And Marcus, they just made their first major tactical error. What error? They assumed I'd walk away when pressured. They assumed documenting their retaliation was something I'd never think to do. And they assumed I don't have resources. Daniel picked up his phone, scrolling through contacts. I know journalists who specialize in military veteran stories. I know attorneys who take civil rights cases pro bono specifically to fight this kind of systemic abuse. I know veterans advocacy groups that live for stories about disabled vets being crushed by wealthy families with corrupt police connections. The Hardings think they're fighting a blind man and a temporary stranger. They don't realize they just picked a fight with a network that spans the entire military community. You do that? Go public with this. Not yet. First, we're going to try something they won't expect. Daniel dialed a number, waited for it to connect. Richard Harding thinks he's immune because he controls the local power structure. But there's one thing men like him care about more than control: reputation. and I'm about to introduce him to the concept of strategic pressure." The person on the other end answered, and Daniel's voice shifted to professional formality. "Captain Chen, it's Sergeant Reese. I need to activate Plan B. They're retaliating against the victim, and local law enforcement is compromised." "Yes, ma'am. I have documentation of everything. How quickly can your civilian contact take the case?" He listened, nodded, glanced at Marcus with something that might have been a smile. 48 hours works perfectly. "Thank you, ma'am." The attorney's name was Rebecca Park, and she arrived at Marcus's apartment Monday morning with the focused intensity of a missile locked on target. She was in her early 40s, Korean-American, dressed in a sharp charcoal suit that communicated competence and authority. She carried a leather briefcase that probably cost more than Marcus's monthly rent, and she spent exactly 45 seconds on pleasantries before getting to work. "Mr. Thompson, I've reviewed everything Sergeant Reese sent me. The witness statement, the recordings, the timeline of retaliation. I'm going to be very direct with you. You have an exceptionally strong case for both criminal prosecution and civil litigation. However, strong cases require cooperation, documentation, and most importantly, a willingness to fight when things get uncomfortable." She set her briefcase on the kitchen table and pulled out a tablet. "Sergeant Reese mentioned you're considering giving up. Before you make that decision, let me explain what we're actually dealing with and what your options are." Marcus sat across from her, Daniel standing behind him like a sentinel. Atlas lay in his recovery crate nearby, his dark eyes watching the stranger with the alert caution of a working dog assessing threats. Rebecca pulled up a document on her tablet. "Richard Harding is the CEO of Harding Maritime Holdings, a company with approximately $47 million in annual revenue. He owns 6 marinas, 3 waterfront restaurant properties, and has development contracts for 2 major mixed-use projects currently in the planning phase. He's politically connected, financially secure, and has a documented history of using intimidation tactics when crossed." "That's supposed to make me feel better about fighting him?" Marcus asked dryly. "That's supposed to help you understand that he's vulnerable in ways you haven't considered." Rebecca swiped to another screen. "Men like Harding build empires on reputation and relationships. His business depends on city permits, environmental approvals, financing from banks that care about public image. His developments require community support, city council votes, investor confidence. All of that is fragile when exposed to the right kind of pressure." She pulled up a news article. 3 years ago, Harding Maritime Holdings was sued by a former employee for wrongful termination after she reported sexual harassment by a manager. The case was settled out of court with an NDA. 2 years ago, an environmental group filed complaints about illegal dock construction at one of his marinas. That case was dismissed after Harding made significant donations to local conservation charities. Last year, a contractor filed a mechanics lien claiming Harding refused to pay for completed work. That case settled quietly after Harding's attorneys buried the contractor in discovery motions until he couldn't afford to continue. Marcus felt something shift in his chest. Not hope exactly, but the first stirring of possibility. "You're saying he has a pattern. I'm saying he has a documented history of using his wealth and connections to avoid accountability. And I'm saying that pattern becomes a narrative when the right people tell the story." Rebecca looked between Marcus and Daniel. "Sergeant Reese called in a favor from a JAG officer who happens to be a friend of mine. Captain Chun and I worked together on a case involving military contractor fraud 5 years ago. When she told me about your situation, I was interested. When I saw the evidence Daniel had documented, I was committed. This is exactly the kind of case my firm takes specifically, because firms like mine need to exist to counter people like Richard Harding." "I can't afford." "Pro bono," Rebecca interrupted. "No fees unless we win a settlement or civil judgment. And even then, you pay nothing. We cover all costs. This is the kind of case that makes the news, that sets precedent, that reminds other wealthy families that they can't just crush vulnerable people without consequence. My firm gets the publicity, you get justice, and Harding gets accountability. Everyone wins except the people who deserve to lose." Daniel leaned forward, his arms crossed. "What's the tactical approach?" Rebecca smiled, and it reminded Daniel of commanders planning operations. Multi-pronged pressure campaign. First, criminal prosecution. We bypass Wilmington PD entirely and take this straight to the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation and the District Attorney's Public Integrity Unit. Hit and run, DWI, witness intimidation. Those are serious charges, and when coupled with evidence of local police corruption, state authorities get very interested very quickly. She swiped to another screen. Second, federal civil rights lawsuit. Mr. Thompson is a disabled veteran whose civil rights were violated through a conspiracy between private citizens and law enforcement. That's a federal cause of action under 42 U.S.C. Section 1983. We file in federal court, which means Harding's local connections are meaningless. Federal judges don't care about your marina donations. Third, public pressure. We coordinate with veterans advocacy groups, military support organizations, and media contacts to tell your story. Disabled Marine veteran service dog nearly killed by drunk driver. Victim retaliated against when he refuses hush money. Local police protect wealthy family. That story plays very well on social media and local news, especially in a military-heavy state like North Carolina. Marcus felt overwhelmed by the strategic complexity. When do we start? We already have. I filed the federal lawsuit this morning. The SBI will receive our complaint and evidence package by this afternoon. And I've scheduled a meeting with the editor of the Wilmington Star-News for tomorrow morning. They love stories about local corruption, and one of their investigative reporters is a Marine Corps veteran who will be very sympathetic to your situation. Harding will retaliate harder, Daniel said quietly. The eviction, the lawsuit, the animal control investigation, that was opening pressure. When he realizes we're escalating, he'll escalate too. Which is why Mr. Thompson isn't staying in this apartment. Rebecca pulled out a business card and handed it to Marcus. I've arranged temporary housing through a veteran services nonprofit. Fully accessible apartment, no cost, available starting today. We move you out before the eviction deadline, which means Harding's property management company loses that leverage. We're also filing for a restraining order against Brandon and Richard Harding, and I've already contacted Animal Control's director to file a formal complaint about retaliatory investigations. You did all this since last night? Marcus asked, stunned. I did all this since 4:30 this morning, when I finished reviewing Daniel's files. Mr. Thompson, I don't take cases I'm not prepared to win, and I don't let my clients face retaliation alone. She stood, closing her tablet. Now, let's talk about your immediate safety. Daniel mentioned he's on leave for 30 days, but I'm assuming you'll eventually need to return to duty? 28 days left, Daniel confirmed. Then we need to move quickly. I'm going to recommend you both relocate to the temporary housing today. It's a secure building, requires key card access, has security cameras. It's also owned by a veterans organization with very strong opinions about people who harm disabled vets, which means Harding's usual intimidation tactics won't work. Over the next 6 hours, they executed the move with military precision. Daniel rented a truck, packed Marcus's belongings, and transferred everything to the new apartment, while Rebecca coordinated with the veterans organization, filed restraining order paperwork, and made phone calls to state investigators. By 6 p.m., Marcus and Atlas were settled in a clean, modern apartment on the 8th floor of a building with actual security, and the eviction notice from his old landlord was rendered moot. By 8 p.m., Rebecca had received confirmation that the North Carolina SBI had opened an investigation into both the hit-and-run incident and potential police corruption related to the case. And by 10 p.m., Richard Harding received a phone call from his attorney informing him that he was being sued in federal court for civil rights violations, that state investigators were reviewing the criminal case, and that a reporter from the Star-News had left 3 messages requesting comment about allegations of witness intimidation and police corruption. Richard Harding made a decision that powerful men often make when challenged. He decided to crush the threat completely, permanently, and publicly. Tuesday morning began with a process server arriving at the temporary apartment building with a new lawsuit. Richard Harding personally was now suing Marcus Thompson for intentional infliction of emotional distress, defamation, and abusive process, claiming that Marcus had maliciously fabricated allegations against the Harding family to extort money through fraudulent litigation. The lawsuit demanded $50,000 in damages and requested an emergency hearing to freeze Marcus's assets pending resolution. It was theater. The lawsuit would be dismissed easily, but it served its purpose, demonstrating that Harding could multiply legal fronts faster than Marcus could defend against them, could force him to appear in court repeatedly, could generate paperwork and hearings and motions that would consume time and resources. Tuesday afternoon, Brandon Harding posted on his Instagram account with 32,000 followers a carefully crafted statement claiming he was the victim of false accusations by a mentally unstable veteran who was trying to extort his family, that he was heartbroken that his genuine attempt to help a struggling person had been twisted into something sinister, and that he trusted the legal system to expose the truth. The post was accompanied by a photo of Brandon at a charity event with sick children, his face radiating compassion. The post went viral in Wilmington social circles within hours, and Marcus began receiving text messages from numbers he didn't recognize. Anonymous threats, accusations of being a fraud, claims that he was giving real veterans a bad name. But Tuesday evening was when Richard Harding made his critical mistake. Daniel had taken Atlas for a slow, careful walk around the block, physical therapy prescribed by the veterinarian, gentle movement to prevent muscle atrophy while the hip healed. The German Shepherd moved with a pronounced limp, his injured leg bearing minimal weight, but his tail wagged at the attention from his new friend, at the chance to be outside after days of cage rest. They were returning to the apartment building when Daniel noticed a car, a silver Mercedes S-Class, parked across the street with the engine running. Tinted windows, expensive rims, a license plate framed from a luxury dealership. The car had been there when they'd left for the walk 20 minutes ago, and it was still there now. Engine idling, someone inside watching. Daniel's training kicked in with automatic precision. He memorized the license plate, noted the make and model, cataloged the vehicle's position relative to exits and sight lines. He didn't alter his pace, didn't signal that he'd noticed, simply continued walking Atlas toward the building entrance while his peripheral vision tracked the Mercedes. The car pulled away from the curb as Daniel reached the door, accelerating slowly down the street before turning at the corner. Not aggressive, not overtly threatening, but unmistakably deliberate. A message, we know where you are. Daniel pulled out his phone as the apartment building's elevator climbed to the 8th floor, texting Rebecca. Harding or associate conducting surveillance on temporary housing. Silver Mercedes S-Class, license NCR 9471. Observed vehicle Tuesday 6:45 p.m. Not immediately threatening, but establishes pattern of stalking behavior. Rebecca's response came before the elevator doors opened. Documenting. This strengthens restraining order petition. Don't engage, but continue recording any contact. Inside the apartment, Marcus was listening to the evening news on his audio-accessible tablet, and his face was pale. Daniel, you need to hear this. The news story was about Brandon Harding, specifically about the controversy surrounding allegations from an unnamed disabled veteran who claimed Brandon had committed hit and run. The story featured an interview with Richard Harding, who spoke with perfect soundbites about his son's character, about the family's commitment to veterans' causes, about the tragic situation of mentally ill veterans who sometimes became confused or unstable. The reporter's questions were soft, sympathetic, and the entire segment had the feeling of a PR piece rather than investigative journalism. Channel 7. Marcus said bitterly. Richard Harding's wife is on the board of directors for their parent company. This is what we're fighting. They control the narrative. Daniel listened to the segment twice, his expression unreadable. Then he made a phone call. Rebecca, we need to accelerate the media strategy. Harding just bought himself a puff piece on Channel 7, and he's framing Marcus as mentally unstable. We need alternative coverage immediately, something that can't be bought or controlled. Rebecca's voice was crisp. I'll reach out to the veteran reporter at the Star News tonight. If we can get them to run the story tomorrow with your witness statement and the documentation of retaliation, it'll counter Harding's narrative. But Daniel, you understand that once we go public, this becomes a street fight? Harding will come after both of you with everything he has. Daniel glanced at Marcus, at the exhaustion and determination warring on the man's face, at Atlas lying in his crate with bandaged legs and trusting eyes. He's already coming after us. At least this way, we're fighting back. The Wilmington Star-News ran the story on Wednesday morning, front page of the local section, with a headline that made Richard Harding's blood pressure spike when he read it over breakfast. Disabled veteran faces retaliation after refusing settlement in service dog hit-and-run case. The article was thorough, professional, and devastating. It identified Brandon Harding by name as the driver. It included Daniel's full witness statement, his military credentials, his detailed timeline of events. It documented the pattern of retaliation, the eviction notice, the animal control complaint, the defamation lawsuit, all occurring within 72 hours of Marcus refusing Richard Harding's settlement offer. It quoted Rebecca Park extensively, including her statement that this case represents a textbook example of wealthy families using their resources to intimidate and silence victims who dare to demand accountability. The article included photographs, Marcus with Atlas before the injury, taken from Marcus's Facebook page, the intersection where the collision occurred, a photo of Brandon Harding from his Instagram account, smiling at a fraternity formal, visibly holding a beer. But the element that made the story explode beyond local interest was the sidebar. Navy SEAL witnesses assault, threats against veteran. The reporter had interviewed Daniel extensively, had verified his service record through official channels, and had included his quote, "I've spent 17 years serving this country alongside men and women who sacrificed everything. To watch a drunk driver nearly kill a disabled veteran service dog, and then watch that veteran face retaliation for seeking justice. That's not the country we're defending. Someone has to stand in the gap." The story hit social media before 8 a.m. By 10 a.m., it had been shared 14,000 times on Facebook, had been picked up by military news sites like military.com and Task and Purpose, and had attracted attention from veterans advocacy organizations across the state. The comment sections were unanimous and furious. Outrage at the Hardings, support for Marcus, admiration for Daniel's intervention. By noon, 3 additional news organizations had contacted Rebecca requesting interviews. Producers from a regional news magazine show expressed interest in featuring the story. The North Carolina chapter of Disabled American Veterans issued a public statement supporting Marcus and calling for a thorough investigation into allegations of police corruption and witness intimidation. By 2 p.m., protesters had gathered outside Harding Maritime Holdings' main office. Not a huge crowd, maybe 30 people, but enough to be visible. Veterans in uniform, advocacy groups with signs, local activists who'd been waiting for an opportunity to challenge Harding's influence. The signs read "Justice for Atlas," "Protect our veterans," "Hold the Hardings accountable." And by 4 p.m., Richard Harding's carefully constructed empire began to crack. The first domino was commercial. 3 businesses that leased marina space from Harding Maritime Holdings announced they were terminating their leases and relocating, citing concerns about the company's values and treatment of veterans. One of them was a popular waterfront restaurant that generated significant foot traffic. Losing them meant losing anchor tenant appeal. The second domino was financial. A bank that had been in final negotiations to finance Harding's largest development project requested an emergency meeting to discuss project viability in light of recent negative publicity. The phrase was corporate speak for, "We're worried about our reputation being tied to yours." The third domino was political. The Wilmington City Council member, who'd been Harding's strongest supporter on development permits, issued a public statement saying he was concerned about allegations of impropriety and was requesting the city attorney review all pending Harding projects for proper compliance. Translation: the political winds had shifted, and rats were leaving the ship. But the final, catastrophic domino was legal. At 4:47 p.m., the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation executed a search warrant at the Wilmington Police Department, seizing Sergeant Kyle Morrison's work computer, phone records, and case files related to multiple incidents involving the Harding family over the past 5 years. The warrant was sealed, but the presence of state investigators in the police department was impossible to hide, and speculation exploded across social media and local news. By 5:30 p.m., Morrison was placed on paid administrative leave, pending investigation. By 6 p.m., the Wilmington police chief held a press conference announcing full cooperation with state authorities in reviewing department procedures and emphasizing that any officer found to have acted inappropriately will be held accountable. And by 7 p.m., Richard Harding sat in his attorney's office, being told something he'd never heard in his adult life. "Richard, you need to seriously consider settling this case. Immediately. Before it gets worse." "Worse? How does it get worse than state investigators in the police department and protesters outside my business?" His attorney, a man named Warren Castellan who'd protected Harding's interests for 15 years, looked at him with the exhausted patience of someone delivering bad news to a client who refused to accept reality. "It gets worse when the SBI investigation uncovers all the other times Morrison made problems disappear for you. It gets worse when federal investigators start looking into whether this pattern constitutes a criminal conspiracy. It gets worse when your business partners and investors decide you're a liability. And it gets worse when jury pools in any future civil trial are contaminated by weeks of media coverage painting you as the villain. I'm not the villain here. My son made a mistake. Your son committed a felony, and you attempted to cover it up through intimidation and corruption." Warren's voice was hard. "That's not spin, Richard. That's what the evidence shows. The SEAL's witness statement is unimpeachable. The recordings of your conversations demonstrate intent to obstruct justice. The timeline of retaliation against Thompson is documented and damning. If this goes to trial, criminal or civil, you lose. The only question is how much it costs you. So, what are you recommending?" "Full settlement. Pay Thompson's medical expenses. Compensate him for damages. Make a public apology. Get Brandon into a diversion program. Plead to reduce charges. Accept probation. Complete community service and treatment. Take the PR hit now and rebuild quietly over the next year." Richard Harding stared at his attorney, at the walls of the office lined with legal books and framed diplomas that represented decades of making problems disappear, and felt the unfamiliar sensation of being cornered by people who couldn't be bought or intimidated. "And if I refuse?" "Then you roll the dice on a federal civil rights trial where the plaintiff is a blind Marine Corps veteran represented by an attorney who's never lost this kind of case, where the key witness is a Navy SEAL with combat decorations, and where the jury pool has spent months reading about how you tried to crush a disabled veteran to protect your drunk son. Richard, I've been practicing law for 32 years. I know what juries do in cases like that. They don't award damages, they send messages. You'd be lucky to walk away with your business intact." Richard Harding made the call at 8:15 p.m., dialing a number he'd sworn never to call. "Ms. Park? This is Richard Harding. I think it's time we discussed a resolution to this situation." The settlement conference took place Friday morning in a neutral conference room at the federal courthouse, supervised by a magistrate judge who specialized in mediating complex civil rights cases. Richard and Brandon Harding sat on one side of the table with their legal team, looking diminished in a way that wealth couldn't camouflage. Marcus and Daniel sat opposite them with Rebecca Park, Atlas lying calmly at Marcus's feet, his injured leg still braced, but healing steadily. The terms were presented by Rebecca with the clinical precision of someone who'd planned this outcome from the beginning. Brandon Harding would plead guilty to misdemeanor DWI and felony hit-and-run with injury, accept a suspended sentence of 18 months, complete 200 hours of community service at veterans organizations, attend alcohol treatment, and maintain 5 years of probation. His driver's license would be suspended for 3 years. The plea would remain on his record permanently. Richard Harding would pay full restitution for all of Atlas's medical expenses, totaling $11,347. He would pay Marcus Thompson $150,000 in compensatory damages for emotional distress, lost wages, and civil rights violations. He would issue a public apology acknowledging that his family's actions were wrong and that Marcus Thompson's allegations were truthful and justified. Harding Maritime Holdings would donate $50,000 to Freedom Service Dogs, the organization that had trained Atlas, earmarked specifically for training service dogs for disabled veterans. All civil lawsuits filed by the Hardings against Marcus would be dismissed with prejudice. A permanent restraining order would prohibit the Hardings from contacting Marcus or interfering with his life in any way. And finally, the term Rebecca had fought hardest for. Sergeant Kyle Morrison would resign from the Wilmington Police Department effective immediately, forfeiting his pension as part of a separate agreement with the SBI in exchange for avoiding criminal prosecution for obstruction of justice and corruption. Richard Harding signed the agreement with shaking hands, his face gray with the kind of defeat that comes from realizing money can't fix everything. Brandon sat beside him in silence, his earlier arrogance replaced with the hollow-eyed shock of someone whose future had just been permanently redirected. The magistrate reviewed the documents, confirmed all parties understood the terms, and declared the settlement binding and enforceable. It was over in 45 minutes. In the courthouse hallway afterward, Marcus stood with Daniel and Rebecca. Atlas pressed against his leg and tried to process what had happened. "It's really over?" he asked quietly. "The legal case is over," Rebecca confirmed. "The settlement is binding. The funds will be transferred to your account within 7 business days, and the Hardings can't touch you. You're safe. Atlas is safe. And you have enough money to stabilize your life, find new housing, cover expenses while you figure out next steps." Marcus turned his face toward Daniel, his blind eyes wet with tears he'd been holding back for days. "I don't know how to thank you. You didn't know me. You had no reason to help. But you stood up when no one else would, and you didn't walk away when things got hard. You gave me my life back." Daniel felt uncomfortable with the gratitude, with the weight of emotion in Marcus's voice. "You would have done the same. You already did. In Kandahar province, when you put on a uniform and deployed to protect people you'd never met. This was just returning the favor. It was more than that. You reminded me that I'm not alone, that the system can work when someone forces it to, that justice is possible." Marcus extended his hand, and Daniel shook it, feeling the calluses and scars of a man who'd survived more than anyone should have to. Rebecca checked her phone, then looked at Daniel. "The Star News wants a follow-up interview about the settlement. They're running a story tomorrow about the outcome. Are you comfortable being quoted?" Daniel considered, then nodded. "One quote. Make it count." "What do you want to say?" He thought about Rodriguez and Ramadi, about the moment that had defined his career, about the choice between walking away and standing the line. "Say this. In a world where power protects power, justice requires someone willing to stand in the gap. Today, the system worked because people refused to let it fail. That's not heroism. That's citizenship. And it's something everyone can do when they witness injustice." Daniel's leave ended on a Saturday morning in early October, the Carolina coast washed in the golden light of autumn. He'd spent the last week helping Marcus move into a new apartment, this one permanent, affordable, and fully accessible, and watching Atlas heal with the kind of steady progress that good veterinary care and devoted attention made possible. The German Shepherd still limped, still required physical therapy and restricted activity, but the spark was back in his eyes, the confident bearing of a working dog who knew his purpose returning day by day. Marcus stood in the parking lot of his new apartment building, Atlas sitting calmly at his side, waiting to say goodbye to the man who'd changed everything. Daniel's duffel bag was packed in his rental car. His orders recalled him to Virginia Beach for debriefing and reassignment, and the 30 days that had seemed endless when they began had evaporated like morning fog. "You'll keep me updated on how things go?" Daniel asked, the question awkward because neither of them were good at emotional conversations. "Weekly," Marcus promised. Atlas's progress, physical therapy appointments, the job training program Rebecca helped me get into. All of it. And Daniel, I meant what I said before. You gave me more than justice. You gave me hope that there are still people who care, who act, who refuse to let the powerful crush everyone in their path. You would have found the hope eventually. You're stronger than you think. Maybe. But I wouldn't have found it in time. Marcus reached down, his hand finding Atlas's head with the unconscious precision of thousands of hours of partnership. We both owe you our lives. If you ever need anything, and I mean anything, you call me. I don't care if I have to fly across the country. You stood for me when no one else would. I'll do the same for you." Daniel felt something shift in his chest, the loneliness that had driven him to wander into Wilmington a month ago loosening its grip slightly. He'd spent so many years operating alone, trusting only his team, that he'd forgotten what it felt like to build connections outside the military. Marcus wasn't a teammate or a mission objective. He was simply a good man who'd been dealt a bad hand and had fought his way through it with courage and dignity. "Take care of your partner," Daniel said, nodding toward Atlas. "He's a good dog. Best I've seen." "He learned from the best human I've seen," Marcus replied. "Safe travels, Daniel. And thank you for everything." They shook hands one final time, and Daniel climbed into his car. As he drove away, he glanced in the rearview mirror and saw Marcus standing in the parking lot, one hand raised in farewell, Atlas sitting perfectly at heel, and he felt something he hadn't felt in years, satisfaction that his actions had mattered beyond mission parameters and operational success. The Star News ran their follow-up story that Sunday, covering the settlement and the outcomes. The article noted that Brandon Harding had begun his community service at a veterans rehabilitation center, that Richard Harding had issued a public apology that had been met with skepticism but acknowledgement, and that Marcus Thompson had been hired as a peer support counselor for disabled veterans through a VA-contracted nonprofit. The story ended with Daniel's quote about standing in the gap, and within hours, it had been shared across military social media, quoted by veterans organizations, and cited in an editorial about civic responsibility and the importance of witnesses refusing to look away when injustice occurs. But the Real resolution happened quietly, in the small moments that don't make headlines. Marcus returned to the veteran support group he'd attended the night Atlas was injured, but this time, he wasn't silent. He shared his story, the accident, the retaliation, the fight, the victory, and watched as other veterans in the circle sat up straighter, as their expressions shifted from resignation to possibility. One of them, a woman who'd been fighting a denied benefits claim for 3 years, asked Marcus for Rebecca Park's contact information. Another, a man who'd witnessed workplace discrimination but had been too afraid to report it, asked how to document evidence properly. Marcus realized that his story wasn't just about personal justice. It was about showing others that fighting back was possible, that systems could be forced to function, that the powerful weren't untouchable when ordinary people refused to be silent. Atlas healed completely over the next 4 months, regaining full function in his hip, returning to his work as Marcus's guide and partner with the same devoted focus he'd always shown. The scar on his hindquarter became just another mark of survival, and Marcus would sometimes run his fingers across it and remember the night that had changed everything. Daniel returned to his unit, deployed twice more over the next year, and carried the memory of Wilmington as proof that his service meant something beyond classified operations and tactical success. He stayed in touch with Marcus through occasional emails and texts, following Atlas's recovery and Marcus's growing role as an advocate for disabled veterans. And when younger SEALs in his unit asked why he seemed different after his leave, less haunted and more grounded, he told them the truth. Sometimes the most important missions happen when you're not deployed, when you're just a witness who chooses to act instead of looking away. In a world where wealth and connections often shield the powerful from the consequences of their actions, Marcus Thompson's story stands as a reminder that justice is not automatic. It requires courage. Courage from victims who refuse to be silenced despite intimidation and retaliation. Courage from witnesses who choose to stand in the gap when it would be easier to walk away. Courage from attorneys and advocates and everyday citizens who believe the system should work for everyone, not just those who can afford to manipulate it. Brandon Harding's drunk driving nearly killed a service dog and could have destroyed a disabled veteran's life. His father's money and connections almost made the crime disappear. But they didn't count on one variable, a stranger who'd been trained to see threats, to document evidence, and to stand the line when standing required sacrifice. Daniel Reese wasn't a hero. He would reject that label immediately. He was simply someone who recognized injustice and decided his comfort mattered less than doing what was right. That's not exceptional. That's citizenship. That's what communities look like when people refuse to be bystanders to cruelty. If this story touched you, share it. If you know someone facing injustice, be their voice, their witness, their advocate. Document everything. Stand firm when pressure comes. Connect them with resources and people who can help. And always, always, protect those who cannot protect themselves, whether they walk on two legs or four. The powerful aren't untouchable when the right person is watching. And sometimes, all it takes is one person willing to stand in the gap to change everything. Until next time, remember, courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to act despite the cost. And the world changes when ordinary people make that choice.